Kids, today I'm going to talk to you about psychosis. Now, a lot of mentally ill people get psychosis. Psychosis can be acute and it can also be long lasting. I want to describe psychosis quickly in my terms. The best I can describe it is, let's say life is like a river and there's a bank, and if you have psychosis, you're like a leaf that falls in the river and gets swept away. And whatever that psychosis is in your mind is basically the river, and it's taking you away against your will. You have no more say in what happens to you. The psychosis takes over, like the river would take over if you were a leaf, if that makes any sense. Now, I've been mentally ill for a very long time, and I have learned over the course of 30-something years and been in enough psychosis at different times, acute, accidental, intentional, because you can actually intentionally put yourself in a psychosis by giving yourself the right amount of medication or certain kinds of medication. For example, prednisone. If you get a prednisone blast, chances are you're going to go psychotic. And that's why a lot of old people that take high doses of prednisone act a little funky, because they're basically in psychosis and they stay in a chemically induced psychosis. Now, how do you tell that you're in psychosis? Well, you have to learn yourself. That's the key. For example, the first time I was chemically induced into psychosis with prednisone, I had no idea. But when I went back and reported to my doctor the different things I was experiencing, he said, "You've been in psychosis." And he said, "I don't know what's more disturbing, the fact that you didn't find it disturbing and you found it fun and like an adventure, or and didn't check yourself into a hospital, or that you just came in all happy and gleeful to tell me how much fun it was." He was kind of shaken, frankly, because I didn't let the psychosis sweep me down the river. Now, it was actually doing things to me, but I didn't let it to the point where I couldn't function. Now I know when I take prednisone in a certain dose that I'm going to have a psychosis. So already in my mind, I'm waiting. I'm waiting to see how it will manifest. And just because you take it, just because you have like a drug-induced psychosis, doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to manifest the same way each and every time. With the example of prednisone, for example, I have not had the exact same manifestation of psychosis more than once. Every time it's been unique. For example, the first time I had specific food cravings, very specific food cravings, and these really dreadful dreams at night, and they were very specific. And those were the two things that the psychosis brought on. It didn't necessarily bother me. I didn't mind eating that specific food, but there was no reason that I would only eat one particular type of food for the several days that I was psychotic. But that's what happened. And I kept having dreams, very vivid, very gruesome dreams, every night while I slept. Now, I got through them, but it was very specific to that particular psychosis. In this last psychosis that I just had a couple of days ago with prednisone, I kept feeling someone pushing the back of my head and pushing me between the shoulder blades forward, like two hands pushing me, like they were trying to push me over. And I had to constantly deal with this sensation, whether I was awake or asleep, whether I was standing, sitting, or laying down. Now imagine you're laying down watching TV and you feel like someone's trying to shove you up into a sitting position. That's what it felt like. Or if you're sitting and someone feels like they're trying to shove your face down forward. Or if you're standing and someone's trying to push you over. That was the psychosis. But I knew that to expect a psychosis, I just didn't know what to expect. But just that idea that I know helped me when the manifestation came to say, that's a psychosis. You have to file this away as something that is there. It's real, but it's not real. It's a chemical. It's a chemical reaction going on in your brain because of a medication. So although it feels real, and for all intents and purposes in my life it was real, I know it's not. And I know it's just temporary. Now, a lot of people don't do that. A lot of people they're the leaf and they fall into the river and they get swept downstream in their psychosis. And I often wonder, as you get older, how mentally ill people don't try to take responsibility for their own actions. I notice this a lot, and I know that mentally ill people function on different levels. They call us they level us out. But it seems to me that there's only so much you can blame on the mental illness and then so much that, is personal responsibility. Now, I realize that having personal responsibility when you're mentally ill is like 5 or 10 times more difficult than when you don't have mental illness, but it still can be done. I do it. I do my best to not get swept down the river and to keep my head on straight. And frankly, I think society has something to do with this, because if you tell the mentally ill basically that they're strange, that they're different, that they're not responsible for themselves, and you put all these conditions on their lives and all this stigma, it's very easy just to check out. I mean, I will be the first to say, and this is something that dawned on me very early in life. When I was first diagnosed as being batshit crazy, it was a relief. I thought to myself, at first I thought my life was over. Honestly, I thought my life was over. All my dreams, nothing could ever happen good to me, that my life was over, that I was just born to suffer. And once I finished, in the sandbox with my little pity party all by myself, I realized that, and this is like at 17 years old, so I realized that I was just given a ticket of freedom that most people don't have. And what I mean by that, and I mean this seriously, is that I can act any way I want because I'm crazy. I am certified nuts, crazy, can do this. So if I want to go to the supermarket and decide to throw a temper tantrum, even at my age, and get down on the ground and kick and scream like a little child, I can do that. And I'll be excused for it because I'm mentally ill. And that's liberating. Not that I want to go do that particularly, but if I wanted to, I could, whereas people that are not diagnosed mentally ill, not so much. You'd kind of get in trouble for that. But a mentally ill person, they just write it off as, oh, you're mentally ill, go check your medications and talk to your doctor and have a nice day. So that is a huge point, because a lot of mentally ill people have been treated so poorly for so long that they don't necessarily care when they act up. In other words, I mean, I've been in group therapy where you have people that are younger, that are new to mental illness. You have people that are older, that have been around for a long time. You have everybody in between. You have people that are just coming out of an acute phase. You have some people that are just there for maintenance. And so you get all kinds of levels of mental illness and consciousness and age groups. And it's very easy to look and say, okay, you know, here's a 30-year-old. I remember where I was at 30 in my mind and in my ability to deal with my mental illness. I remember where I was when I was 20. I remember where I was when I was 40 or 45. I remember all these things. And so it validates your life, for one, which is why I always recommend that whenever you can, do some group therapy now and then, even if it's just for maintenance, because group therapy will bring you back down and put you in a place where you can look at your life and say, okay, well, I recognize that, or I remember that, or I remember feeling that way, or I remember feeling that wall that somebody's feeling. Because you're always going to get people in group therapy that have walls up in front of them that they put there themselves. And they feel like it's an insurmountable wall that they just can't get through until finally someone gets it to click that they're the only ones that put it there, is their own wall. But I've noticed also with psychosis that they will happily go out and put themselves in a psychotic state, let's say by mixing drugs with their psych meds, or alcohol or whatever, and or just essentially losing it because of they allow something to get to them, and they'll go ahead and misbehave and come back and say, hey, I misbehaved, and so what? That's not taking responsibility for yourself. And in society, what are you going to tell them? Oh, you can't do that? You can't say that. A, it's not politically correct. B, society doesn't treat mentally ill people like they have any sense whatsoever. And quite the opposite. They treat them like they are incapable of making any kind of rational decisions on their own, and they're just loose cannons waiting to go off at any time. Now, if you're always treated like a loose cannon that can go off at any time, what's the motivation not to? I mean, think about that. What is the motivation not to? Unless you have your own self-motivation, which a lot of people, frankly, after a while, they get tired of it and they go, why have this self-motivation when you don't need it? It's not required. No one expects it from you. So you can just go ahead and act up and do whatever you want. But yet they'll still sit there and suffer consequences like having their children taken away by the state, or being thrown in jail, or being put back in an inpatient situation, Baker acted, etc., etc., etc. They just don't mind, because they know eventually they're going to get spun out of the system, and then they're going to go back and they're going to be an outpatient again, and then they can go to group therapy or individual therapy, and someone's going to listen to them, and someone's going to pay negative attention to them when they go ahead and act out, and then the cycle continues. Because if you can't get any positive attention, the next best thing is negative attention. And with psychosis, it's real easy to get some negative attention, because psychosis can be a mental thing. It can be an idea that turns into something like a belief structure that turns into something that is reality, and it's just an idea in your head. But you believe it to be true. Absolutely true. Like solid true. Like a rock. Solid like a rock. As opposed to just a concept. That can be a psychosis. You can have tactile psychosis where you're feeling things physically. You can have psychosis where you're having hallucinations and you have people talking to you, or you're talking to yourself. And those can be very challenging for people that are not used to it, because having voices in your head is very, how do I say this, disruptive at times. If you don't learn how to deal with them, it can, quote, make you crazy. Now, there are people with schizophrenia and schizoaffective disorder. I have schizoaffective disorder, and I've lived with voices in my head my whole life. And for a while, yes, they can be very distracting. And they can kind of shut you down. They can get really loud and very burdensome. But if you learn how to deal with them, then you can shove them back into their place. And yes, even if you start losing some of them, you'll miss them because they become part of you. And people have a hard time understanding that concept also. That just because you hear voices does not mean it's psychosis at all. Now, the jury's out as far as things like the paranormal and ghosts and stuff like that. Some people believe it. Some people think it's just hallucinations. Some people think it's delusions of grandeur. Or, I mean, I've heard every kind of argument about it. And frankly, regardless of what you think, it's not always a psychosis, but it can be. If you think you have a ghost sitting there talking to you, telling you things, doing things with you constantly 24 hours a day, chances are you're probably in a psychosis. But not necessarily. You could actually have a ghost. My personal opinion. The only way you know is you have to know yourself. Are you in a psychosis or aren't you? And only in the end can you actually tell. Now, somebody may be able to help you snap out of or snap back from a psychosis to look at it and say, yes, wow, I'm having a psychosis, or I was in psychosis. That is something that people can help you with, but sometimes people can falsely accuse you of having a psychosis when you're just having a natural course of your own mental illness. For example, like I said, again, with schizoaffective people and schizophrenics, if you're having hallucinations, that's not necessarily a psychosis. That's part of your everyday. That's part of being schizophrenic. Is you're seeing things, you're hearing things, things are touching you, you're smelling things, tasting things. However your hallucinations manifest. When that gets out of control and you get swept down the river and all you are is, and suddenly your hallucinations are totally in control and you've just given up and you're now a victim of your own hallucinations and you're reacting to your hallucinations, then you're in psychosis. And then is when somebody needs to help step you out, or you need to step out yourself and say, hey, this is just not right. This is just not me. And the only way you can do that is to put markers basically in your head and to say, okay, where am I? What's going on with me? And you constantly, it's like a full-time job. You constantly have to keep in mind where you are in your own head and what you're doing and what your health is like and how you're being perceived by others. For example, the other day, I had to go do a charity event for the Lighthouse, which is a great clubhouse for people with mental illness, and we're having an annual charity event. And I volunteered to help. But I was in psychosis. I was in acute psychosis because of prednisone, and I knew that, and I decided to help anyway. And then people showed up early, and it triggered anxiety. It triggered an anxiety attack. So here I am, psychotic and anxious, but I'm still helping. But something changed in my face, so I went from having a pleasant face to bitchy resting face and kind of stony. So people kept asking, what's wrong? Are you okay? Is everything all right? Thank you for helping. Are you sure you're okay? Are you all right? I was as fine as I could be, being anxious and psychotic, but I was unaware that I had bitchy resting face. And had somebody just come out and told me, you're having bitchy resting face, you look pissed, or you look cold or angry, I could have smacked on a smile and finished the evening that way. At least I would have been aware of it. So it's important that you get people, that you keep people around you that you trust to tell you those things, so that you can be aware and you can adjust. Now, had I been aware, I certainly would have adjusted my face and been aware that I was bitchy resting, and stopped it, because no one's got time for that. I mean, yes, I was helping, and yes, I was doing a lot of work, and yes, everybody was thankful, but if you've got a sour look on your face, that just sets a negative tone. That's not necessary, and I didn't need to be there. I mean, I volunteered, and I wanted to do a good job, and doing a good job also is putting a decent smile on your face, or at least something that's not unpleasant and just, scowling. Nobody wants that. So, that's what I got to say about psychosis. It is something that mentally ill people, I believe, that if you train yourself, and training yourself is not easy. Training yourself and keeping yourself aware is a full-time job for you, and you have to have people around you that you trust, that are able to tell you things like something's wrong, or you have bitchy resting face, or you're acting different. You're having an anxiety attack. If I start sweating, it's one of two things. I'm either having something wrong with my blood sugar from my diabetes, or I'm having an anxiety attack, or both. But somebody has to turn around and say, hey, check yourself right now. What is it? Is it the blood sugar? Is it the anxiety? How can we get this fixed? And fix it. That's what we have medications for. That's what food's for. That's what, you can fix these things, but you have to have a good, solid support system that's not shy. And you have to have really close friends that can talk to you, just regular talk to you on, a couple times a week, just to ask what's going on with you. And then they can give you feedback based on their historical knowledge of you, if you're leaning one way or leaning another way, or something's not quite right, or something's a little off, or you're sounding depressed even though you're not realizing you are. The inflection and tone in your voice, the words that you choose, all of those things are important. And you have to monitor them yourself, but you also have to be able to trust people and to monitor them with you. And you can't get defensive. That's another thing I see with the mentally ill, is when someone brings something up, they get defensive. Now, defending your ego is a fool's game. For me, that's my opinion. Your ego does nothing but cause you problems. And if you start fighting with people because they've offended you, or in other words, stomped on your ego, or told you something that you didn't necessarily want to hear or that you don't agree with, well, too damn bad. They need to tell you, and you need to think about it, and you need to check yourself before you wreck yourself. Because I see it so many times, people with good intentions telling somebody that's mentally ill, hey, there's something wrong here, or you might want to consider doing this a different way, or you're screwing this up. And they're not doing it to be mean, but suddenly they get really defensive and it becomes a fight. Now, who wins in a fight? No one. How does that make the situation better? It doesn't. Nothing makes the situation better when you're sitting there defending your ego, whether you're right or you're wrong. Even if they're wrong for some reason, getting angry about it and screaming at them and fighting or calling them names or doing something destructive just to prove that you're the boss and you're in charge is not a productive, helpful thing. It can lead to another psychosis, believe it or not. You can get a psychosis from being too much in your own ego, easily. And that's how, those violent acts happen, is people get so wrapped up in their own ego and their own self that, they do things like if their girlfriend broke up with them, for example, they'll, go out and kill the girlfriend and kill themselves because life doesn't matter anymore, and because they've been rejected and they feel totally offended by it and unable to cope, they're going to go ahead and do a selfish act, and with their ego, they feel like they're doing the best thing or the right thing, or they're going to show them. Now tell me how that's a good thing. That's not a good thing. So your ego can put you in a psychosis really quick. That's why you check it. And you try to minimize your ego as much as possible, because it's never been something that's ever been productive. And it's one of the things, along with fear and doubt, that screw up about 99.9% of the things in life. You can boil it down to either ego, doubt, fear, or a combination of those three. So that's it for psychosis. I hope it was helpful. It's an important subject, and I hope people with mental illness will actually take it serious someday. And the people that work with the mentally ill and the people that live with the mentally ill will realize what an important role they can play, and some of the things to watch out for, particularly that ego, and how you set those rules up in advance. And hopefully the greater society will learn one day not to put so much stigma on the mentally ill, because you're allowing the mentally ill then to just abdicate responsibility for themselves. And by doing so, no one profits. No one's bettered by that, the mentally ill or not, and neither is society as a whole. Thanks for listening. Talk to you later.